Under the cold, white light of an American supermarket, golden blocks of cheese are stacked high on the shelves, marked with discount tags so generous they make shoppers feel like they've just scored a jackpot. Kids reach for tubs of yogurt, and homemakers toss butter and fresh milk into their carts out of habit, barely thinking twice. But thousands of miles away, on sprawling farms in Wisconsin or California, an entirely different scene is unfolding. Streams of pristine white milk pour straight down the drain, soaking into the dirt and vanishing. Farmers stand by, their calloused hands clenched tight, helpless to do anything more, their eyes filled with a quiet mix of frustration and sorrow. This story isn't just about a few trade statistics. It's not some dry policy dispute over import-export regulations. It's a real storm ripping through the entire supply chain, from fields and processing plants to distribution networks, all the way to the dinner tables of everyday families. And that storm was sparked by a sudden sweeping decision. Canada abruptly imposed import tariffs on U.S. dairy products, 250%, 270%, even 300%. Numbers high enough to turn every trade contract into worthless scraps of paper. In less than 48 hours, hundreds of containers filled with cheese, butter, and milk worth nearly $3 billion were denied entry and forced to turn back. Refrigerated ships that were moments away from docking were ordered to divert. Trucks loaded with goods were halted right at the border barricades. The speed of it all left observers stunned. American retail giants were caught completely off guard, cold storage facilities overflowing with unsellable inventory, while the domestic market reeled from a sudden flood of excess supply. U.S. media dubbed it the iron punch from the north, while farmers saw it as a death sentence hanging over an already fragile dairy industry. But to truly understand why Canada dared to strike with such force, we need to look back into history, to a system called supply management, which has shaped the way Canada has protected its farmers for over half a century. And from that historical foundation, Canada's response today is not merely a trade decision. It's a declaration of a core principle they're unwilling to compromise. To understand how Canada could so coldly and swiftly slam shut the doors of trade, we have to rewind the clock back to the 1960s, when the country first laid the foundations for a system called supply management. This was a mechanism designed not to maximize profits on the international market, but to ensure the survival of domestic farmers, maintain stable prices, and uphold the highest standards of quality. From milk and eggs to poultry, everything was placed under strict regulation. Production was capped based on domestic demand, import quotas were clearly defined, and anything exceeding those quotas was hit with tariffs so high they were practically prohibitive. This very system became a sturdy shield for Canadian farmers. While many countries allowed their agricultural goods to ride the roller coaster of global prices, rising and crashing with every market fluctuation, Canada chose the path of strict protection. Domestic consumers may have had to pay a little more, but in return, they got products free from growth hormones, with clear traceability and, most importantly, stability, free from the devastating price collapses that could wipe out farmers in a single season. This firmness was also reinforced by political realities. In provinces like Quebec and Ontario, the dairy industry isn't just an economic sector. It's part of the cultural identity tied to hundreds of thousands of jobs and rural communities that have existed for generations. Any government that dares to touch the interests of this sector must be prepared to face fierce backlash. That's why defending the supply management system isn't just an economic policy, it's a political promise to voters. When the USMCA trade agreement was born, Canada agreed to a small concession, allowing the US access to 3.6% of its dairy market. But to Ottawa, that figure marked a red line. Anything beyond that quota wasn't just a technical breach, it was a direct threat to the sustainability of the entire system. And yet, in mid-2025, Washington allowed a flood of U.S. dairy products to enter the Canadian market well beyond the agreed limits. At prices so low, Ottawa labeled it dumping, an act they believed, if left unchecked, would make it impossible for Canadian farmers to survive. To the U.S., this may have been nothing more than a trade maneuver, an attempt to offload surplus goods. But to Canada, it was a warning sign that their protective shield was being tested. And when that shield is threatened, they don't hesitate to draw their sword in response. Rooted in that history and mindset, Ottawa's counterstrike was never a question of should we, but we must, and we must now. And so, in a move that stunned the entire market, Canada chose to launch a lightning-fast retaliation, a blow that forced hundreds of U.S. dairy containers to turn back at the border, opening a new and deeply tense chapter in a trade war that, on the surface, appeared to be just about blocks of cheese and bottles of milk. Canada's counterstrike happened so fast that many in the industry hadn't even had time to process what was going on. In just 2 days, over 200 containers of cheese, butter, and milk, all en route to Canadian markets, were stopped right at the border. Refrigerated trucks lined up for miles, brake lights glowing red under the overcast sky. Drivers sat slumped on the roadside, phones pressed to their ears, calling back to their companies, only to receive the same helpless shrug of a response. On the other side of the line, Canadian Customs issued a curt announcement. The shipments had exceeded the quota, and tariffs of up to 300% would apply. At that rate, clearance was simply out of the question. But this wasn't just a bureaucratic maneuver, it was a powerful symbolic gesture. One premium shipment of cheese from a well-known American brand, heavily promoted for months ahead of its grand debut in Toronto's high-end food counters, was denied entry just before launch. Pristine white cheeses, wrapped in elegant silver foil, never made it to the warm glow of gourmet displays. Instead, they sat cold and still in warehouse limbo, waiting for the journey back to the U.S. And when they returned, they had lost their luxury appeal, shuffled onto discount shelves in fluorescent-lit supermarkets next to other forgotten inventory. The immediate consequence, cold storage facilities across the U.S. began overflowing. Already running near capacity, the logistics systems had to strain further to absorb the sudden flood of returned goods. Major retailers like Walmart, Target, and Kroger were forced to launch aggressive clearance campaigns just to free up space, turning the consumer market into a frenzy of unprecedented markdowns. Shoppers rejoiced at the bargains, but for those within the industry, it was a clear sign of a supply chain under extreme duress. What made the blow even more bitter was that many of the rejected shipments had already encountered trouble elsewhere. Some had previously been turned away from other markets for failing quality standards, and were rerouted to Canada in hopes of a second chance. But with the northern door now slammed shut, their commercial value all but vanished. For producers, this was a double hit. Not only did they lose the market, but they now had to shoulder the costs of retrieval and disposal. The once smooth, two-way trade flow between the US and Canada suddenly fell into chaos. Logistics firms had to cancel routes, pending orders were put on indefinite hold. With every passing hour, tens of thousands of dollars evaporated into operational, storage, and preservation costs. Meanwhile, anxiety spread rapidly from distributors to farmers. Questions like, is this just a temporary retaliation or the start of a drawn-out trade war, echoed through company hallways, coffee shops, even in emergency industry meetings. In major dairy-producing states like Wisconsin and California, concern turned into immediate pressure. Canada's rejection didn't just spike inventories, it also meant that millions of gallons of fresh milk being produced daily now had nowhere to go. Without a swift solution, it would only be a matter of weeks before we'd once again see the painful sight of milk being poured down the drain, and this time on a much larger scale. From cold warehouses thick with the chill of congealed dairy, to the tense negotiation rooms in Washington, one thing became clear. Canada's border blockade wasn't just about enforcing quotas, it was a warning shot. A message that Ottawa was willing to sacrifice long-standing trade relationships to protect its farmers. And that message, echoing across the border, has already begun to shake not only trade policy, but daily life in America, where the economic and social impacts of this shock are about to become sharply visible. In the US, the shock from the northern border quickly rippled into a full-blown tremor across the major dairy-producing states. Just weeks after Canada shut its import gates, domestic milk prices took a nosedive. The statistics, which might seem like dry data, told a harsh truth. Wholesale milk prices dropped so low that many producers had no choice but to sell at a loss, just to clear out the stockpile clogging up cold storage facilities. For small farms, especially in Wisconsin and California, the heartlands of American dairy, that meant choosing between shutting down or taking on more debt to stay afloat, all while facing an uncertain future. Images of farming families standing by wooden fences, looking out at their herds, knowing that every gallon of milk they produced might have nowhere to go, became haunting symbols of the crisis. Many had weathered price fluctuations before, but this time they were facing a new kind of wall, not shrinking demand, but a critical export market that had slammed shut overnight. For farms that relied heavily on long-term contracts with distributors shipping to Canada, this hit was like a sudden flood washing away everything they'd planned for. The chain reaction was swift and brutal. Transport companies slashed routes due to a lack of export goods, while cold storage facilities and processing plants had to ramp up capacity to handle the growing backlog. Electricity bills, labor costs, and maintenance expenses soared, eating further into already thinning margins. At retail chains, discounted dairy products flooded the shelves. Prices dropped so sharply that consumers felt like they were getting a steal. But what they were really seeing was an industry in crisis. What's bitterly ironic is that most shoppers had no idea what lay behind those low prices. The bank debts of struggling farmers, the family meetings where land was being considered for sale, the sleepless nights of dairy owners unsure if they'd be able to pay their workers the following month. A lack of transparency in product labeling, with many imported or rejected dairy goods still ending up on shelves under familiar brand names, made it even harder for consumers to connect what they were buying to the storm raging behind the scenes. For some large corporations, this shock became a stress test. They rushed to reallocate supply to other markets, accelerated value-added processing, or launched new product lines to retain consumer attention. But even the big players couldn't deny that losing access to Canada meant losing a key pillar of their export strategy, especially when geographic proximity and logistics had been their greatest competitive edge. Back in Washington, policymakers were now under pressure to respond. But how to respond was a far tougher question. Retaliatory tariffs risked escalating the conflict, while concessions would draw criticism for appearing weak. And amid the political tug-of-war, the farmers, the people directly affected, still had to wake up each morning and milk their cows, even as the storage tanks filled closer to the brim each day. This crisis laid bare a reality that America has long tried to sidestep. When an agricultural supply chain depends too heavily on just a few export markets, even a single blow from outside can throw the whole system into turmoil. It also raised a difficult question about long-term strategy. Can the U.S. continue producing in surplus and pushing excess onto the world, or does it need a more balanced structure to reduce vulnerability? And as America scrambled for answers, a different story was unfolding on the other side of the border. While U.S. milk prices whipsawed, Canada's domestic market remained shockingly stable. The very protectionist system that had long drawn American criticism had become a shield, a lifeline, helping Canada stand firm amid the storm now battering its southern neighbor. In Canada, the story unfolds in an entirely different tone. On supermarket shelves in cities like Montreal and Vancouver, the prices of milk, butter, and cheese remain virtually unchanged. Consumers continue to buy cartons labeled 100% Canadian milk with the confidence that every dollar they spend helps sustain local farms. There are no waves of clearance sales, no alarming headlines about bankrupt farmers. The supply management system, often criticized as a tariff wall, has instead become a sturdy shield holding the domestic market steady against the economic storms brewing beyond its borders. For many Canadians, paying a little more for a liter of milk isn't a burden, it's a conscious choice. They understand that behind every carton is a closed-loop production system, free of growth hormones and fully traceable down to the individual farm. For many families, this isn't just about health, it's about pride and trust in a sustainable agricultural model. That's why, when Ottawa moved decisively to block U.S. products that exceeded import quotas, the public didn't push back. On the contrary, many saw it as a defense of the country's core values. This sense of stability has also delivered significant political gains. The government can confidently assure voters that they're not allowing Canadian farmers to be swept away by the chaos of global markets. In provinces like Quebec and Ontario, where the dairy industry is deeply woven into the cultural identity and the fabric of rural communities, the move was even seen as a promise to preserve a part of the national heritage. Images of the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers shaking hands with farmers in open fields became powerful media symbols, sending a clear message. Ottawa won't let any trade deal undermine the foundations of this system. For Canada, protectionism isn't just a trade tactic, it's a survival strategy. It allows the country to maintain critical food self-sufficiency, safeguard the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of citizens, and most importantly, retain complete control over the quality of its food supply. In a world increasingly plagued by food insecurity, disease outbreaks, and climate instability, that kind of resilience is priceless. But protectionism is also a double-edged sword. Every time Ottawa wields this shield to repel imports, it sends a strong message to the global trade arena. Canada is willing to act unilaterally to defend its domestic interests. And in a world where trade, politics, and geopolitics are tangled like tightly wound ropes, a move like that doesn't stay contained within bilateral relations. It echoes far beyond the border, becoming part of the broader game of global power, where blocks of cheese and crates of milk can become pawns in a high-stakes match between nations. At first glance, Canada's dairy tariff strike may have seemed like a simple bilateral response to the US, but in reality, it sent a message that echoed far beyond the border. Ottawa is willing to wield its protectionist shield as a weapon in trade, no matter who the opponent is. In a world already shaken by tariff wars, broken supply chains, and a global resurgence of protectionism, Canada's move served as a sharp reminder that domestic market control can still be prioritized over any promise of integration. Other trading partners took notice and began re-evaluating how they approach American agricultural goods. The European Union, Japan, even Australia, markets already known for strict technical barriers, suddenly saw anti-dumping and preventing global oversupply as valid justifications for shielding their own dairy industries. Quietly, some European countries began raising sanitary and traceability standards, indirectly restricting US products. In Asia, Japan started reassessing its quota system, wary of letting cheap imports from across the Pacific destabilize its carefully structured domestic production. These developments have put the US in a difficult spot. When a major market like Canada takes such bold action and is met with public support, it sets a precedent. If that domino effect spreads, the US could soon face a web of new barriers, not just in dairy, but across its entire agricultural and processed food sectors. Every country has its own reasons to protect its farmers, and Canada's bold move has only strengthened those justifications. Behind this strategic play, many observers point to the quiet but calculated influence of Mark Carney, the former central bank governor of both Canada and the UK, a man deeply versed in global finance and market psychology. More than a technocrat, Carney is a strategist who knows how to seize the moment. By triggering the tariff strike at a time when US dairy supply was overflowing and Washington was still scrambling to respond, he maximized the shock. The blow forced the US to face the consequences immediately, leaving no time to adjust or soften the impact. It was a cold, calculated move, and an effective one, that sent a clear message. One hit is enough to make your opponent think twice before acting again. Zooming out to the broader geopolitical chessboard, the dairy dispute reflects a more dangerous trend. Food, once seen as a space for cooperation, is becoming a tool for leverage and pressure. In a world increasingly divided into competing blocks, where trade and food security are intertwined, even seemingly ordinary products like cheese or milk are now strategic assets. And as more countries realize that protectionism can be used to strengthen their bargaining power, the wave of new trade barriers is no longer a question of if, but when. For Canada, this wasn't just about defending dairy. It was a declaration of their resolve to protect national interests at all costs. For the US, it was a wake-up call. Export power doesn't guarantee success. And for the rest of the world, it was a clear signal that the global trade order is shifting into a new phase, where the ideals of free and open are giving way to strategy and self-preservation. In the midst of this transformation, nations that depend heavily on agricultural exports must now ask themselves, how can we survive when a single tariff decision from halfway across the world can throw an entire industry into crisis? That question, and the hard lessons from the dairy war of 2025, may be the starting point for imagining a future where the line between commerce and politics has all but disappeared. From the dairy dispute between the US and Canada, three key lessons stand out, as clear and lasting as the furrows left in a field after a storm. First is the lesson of quota governance. Numbers and clauses in a trade agreement, which may seem like mere technicalities, can in fact draw the line between survival and collapse. When one side crosses that line, even by a few percentage points, the response from the other won't be polite negotiation, but a direct hit powerful enough to shake an entire industry. The second lesson lies in the fragility of the supply chain. In times of overproduction, without a smart strategy for distribution and contingency, every production advantage can quickly turn into a burden. Returned containers, overstuffed cold storage, milk poured down the drain. These are the prices paid when a backup plan is too weak or non-existent. And finally, there's the lesson of balance between openness and defense. Rapid-fire exports may create the illusion of success, but without carefully weighing the risks and market thresholds, that very success can become a fatal vulnerability. From these lessons, the future opens up with a range of scenarios. In the optimistic version, the US and Canada will de-escalate, return to the table, revise quotas, and craft support measures for farmers, re-establishing the decades-long trade rhythm. But escalation is also possible. The US could retaliate with tariffs of its own, pulling other sectors into the fray and turning a dairy skirmish into a full-scale trade war. In the longer term, the US may be forced to restructure its dairy industry altogether, investing in value-added processing, diversifying exports, and targeting markets less exposed to political trade barriers. No matter how it plays out, the dairy war of 2025 will be remembered as a warning shot. It reminds nations that in a world of entangled interests, a single tariff decision never affects just one product. It can trigger sweeping change, dragging in sectors that seem completely unrelated. And in the end, survival won't belong solely to the strongest producers, but to those who had the foresight to plan an escape route before the storm arrived. The dairy storm of 2025 began with what seemed like a few dry tariff figures, but as it swept across the border, it carved deep marks into the economic and political landscape of both nations. From Wisconsin farms dumping milk down the drain, to grocery shelves in Montreal still fully stocked with domestic products, this story revealed just how thin the line can be between stability and crisis. In a world where supply chains are woven together like a spider's web, it takes only one strained thread to send tremors through the entire system. And sometimes the one pulling that thread isn't a global corporation or a world crisis, but a single policy decision made in a matter of hours. The critical lesson here is this: the interconnectivity of the global economy cannot be underestimated. A single market, a single sector, even a single product can become the flashpoint for a chain reaction that reverberates across continents. To survive, nations and businesses must be agile enough to adapt and wise enough to know when to step back to protect their long-term interests. A good product is essential, but smart strategy and clear-eyed awareness of volatility are what truly determine resilience. Looking back, the dairy storm wasn't just a story about cows, milk crates, or trade statistics. It was a mirror reflecting the essence of our era, a time when commerce, politics, and national security are inseparable, and every decision holds the potential to trigger a tidal wave. And in the midst of those waves, only those who understand the rules, who can plan both the advance and the retreat, will remain standing. If this story offered you a new perspective, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the deep dive analyses and timely stories I'll be bringing you in future videos. Because every story, even one that starts with a glass of milk, can help us better understand the vast and intricate world we live in.